So, thank you guys for being here. We're going to talk about components of an IED for my CMST 370 class. Just a little background. You guys know who I am. Greg Griffin for you guys. I was an EOD tech for 8 years in the Army, which you guys also know. So we're going to be going over the components of an IED because you guys need this information. Super technical for your super technical jobs. Okay, so the most obvious component of an explosive device is the explosive. There are two types, generally speaking, two categorizations of explosions. We've got mechanical explosions. Mechanical explosion is basically just a container rupturing. Have you guys heard of a Mentos bomb? Right, 16 years old, drop a Mentos in a Coke, it off-gases, ruptures the container. That's a mechanical explosion. It's not really an explosion. All it is more gas than the container can handle. Ends up rupturing the container, makes a loud boom. Now, you can magnify that, right, with a pipe bomb, something like that, something else that burns. Typically, though, it's not going to be a high explosive that's inside of that. Requires a container. If you just take that material that's inside of whatever container you have and burn it in open air or let it have its off-gassing reaction in open air, it's not going to cause anything violent. Cork shooting from a wine bottle is a perfect example of this. So when you open like a champagne bottle, right, it's got the carbonation on the inside, you start pushing the cork out, gets to a certain point where that cork's just going to automatically shoot out pretty violently, right? It's a very small example of exactly what we're doing with a mechanical kind of explosion. Not something I'm really going to talk about too much here, but just an awareness kind of thing. The material creating the pressure is not capable of a detonation. All it does is deflagrate, which is burn or off-gas. And typically, yeah, we already covered that one. It's something that's going to produce gas or burn. Chemical explosion, okay, that's what we're actually talking about when we talk about explosives. High explosives, low explosives. We're talking about something that's 8,000 feet per second or more when it goes through a chemical reaction. This one does not require a container. Sitting in an open area, this will cause a chemical reaction that will be a detonation, right? So what you typically think of an explosion. They are called high explosives. They can also be low explosives. Low explosives is anything below 13,000 feet per second. High explosive is above 13,000 feet per second. Three general categories of explosives. You're looking at military, commercial, and homemade explosives. Military explosives typically are going to be a bit more stable, have a long shelf life, right? Because that's what the military uses them for, right? That's their sole purpose. They are designed chemically for the military. Commercial explosives, that's what you're going to see blasting agents, things that companies, quarrying companies, mining companies are going to use. Still pretty stable, a little less on the shelf life, and they're going to be typically binary mixtures, two different materials that you're going to put together. And then homemade explosives. So these are the ones that are super dangerous. These are the ones that you're seeing in IEDs predominantly. So let's talk about high explosives a little bit. They can be classified into three groups: primary, secondary, tertiary. And those groups are based on their sensitivities. Primary explosives are super sensitive. Secondary explosives, not so much. Require a primary explosive in order to go off. It's going to be called an explosive train. Tertiary explosives, even less sensitive than the secondary explosives. Again, you're going to have a primary, then a secondary, then a tertiary for the tertiaries to actually detonate. They can be solid, liquids, gel suspensions, or clay-like materials. Basically, they can come in any form that you can possibly think of. All right? They vary in compositions, functions, and uses based on their physical structure and velocity of detonations. So when we talk about military and commercial explosives, that's what we're talking about with classifications. The homemade explosives pretty much are not that. They're going to change depending on who makes them. Their whole chemical composition is going to vary every time. Each batch of homemade explosives is going to be unique. Generally, all explosives are sensitive to heat, shock, and friction. So what makes the explosives detonate? The detonator. Imagine that. So, like the explosives, you can have military, commercial, or homemade detonators. Military detonators are, again, going to be a little bit more stable. They also typically come in the form of a blasting cap, which is going to be a cylinder about the size of your pinky or smaller that you stick directly into the explosives. Commercials are the same way, almost exactly, but they have a little bit more variation in how they're used and how they work. Now, homemade detonators can be a little bit different. They can make them exactly like the military or commercial blasting caps. However, they can also, they're only limited by their imagination. So a homemade detonator can be completely and totally chemical, or it can be a primary explosive that's sensitive to, say, a small electric shock or maybe some kind of impact. Again, it's completely up to the imagination of the individual that's making said detonator. They will, however, always be made from primary explosives, because primary explosives have to be super sensitive, have to be able to detonate them relatively easily. The explosives that are used in initiators are not used in main charges because of their sensitivity. If you have too much of it together, highly volatile. That's why you end up hearing about people blowing themselves up all the time, trying to use too many primary explosives on stuff. So what makes the initiator detonate? We already talked about what makes the explosive, the actual main charge, detonate. That is the detonator itself. Detonator, initiator, these are synonyms. So what makes that detonator detonate? All right, typically it's going to be a power source. Now it doesn't have to be. We're going to use the term power source super loosely right now, okay? Power source can come in many forms. Typically you're looking at a power source, battery, capacitor, some kind of electronic component that provides an electric pulse. An outlet, a home outlet, can also be a detonator that also functions as a switch as well. And then certain minerals will also produce an electric charge in and of themselves. So while most IEDs do incorporate a power source, it's not necessary for IEDs. But the vast majority of them do have power sources. Probably the most variable component, and the last one that we have, are switches. Switch is what determines what will detonate the device. All right? So the only limit, again, to a switch is the imagination of the bomber here. So that's kind of an underlying theme in this whole process. The imagination of the bomber is what determines pretty much the limitations of what can be incorporated into an IED. However, all of these components will be present, and I'll show you how that works later. So, switch classifications here by functioning. We have victim-initiated, command-detonated, and time. Those are pretty much the only classifications that you're ever going to see. Victim-initiated would be something like you have a bag, the bag is rigged to go off. If you open that bag, it will go off, right? So you unzip something, or maybe unclamp something, or maybe open an envelope and pull something out. You're connecting a switch there, and that's what's going to detonate it. So that would be victim-initiated. Another concept that falls under victim-initiated would be suicide. So technically, we're kind of stretching the concept of a victim here. However, in a suicide bombing, one of the victims, in theory and by definition, would be the bomber themselves. So if they initiate it themselves, that would be technically victim-initiated. Now we have command-detonated. So that's kind of where the crossover goes. Looking at that suicide scenario as well, that would also be command, because that victim is probably, now not always, but probably the one that is setting off that device. So that would be command-detonated as well. That could be a wire running to the device, some 100 yards away, whatever. That could also be a radio or a cell phone or something that's rigged to set off the initiator. And then time. So time, that's going to be your typical, 3 sticks of dynamite and a timer attached to it. It is what it is. So let's talk about two different examples here of the complexity that we can be looking at with IEDs. Back in 1980, Harvey's Resort Hotel bombing in Nevada. So what happened here is you had a guy that lost $2.2 million apparently at the casino, and he and 2 other individuals decided to place this device at this casino hotel. And this thing is super complicated. Okay, it had multiple switches. He left a little statement there that told all the different ways that this thing's going to go off, didn't go into detail, didn't provide blueprints, right, so they couldn't do anything with it. After about a day and a half of x-rays and analysis with multiple bomb technicians, they decided that they were going to try to explosively render this item safe. Failed miserably, right, because it was so complex. They ended up detonating the device and pretty much leveled the building. Nobody got hurt because they knew it was there, so everybody was already evacuated. But that's just an example of how complex it can be. This is kind of the gold standard for the concept of not every device can be safe. It's just not possible. And conversely, and I will get this graphic here registered. I'm going to put in for a trademark here. So, simple device, right? What we're looking at here, we've got a guy with a hammer and a pile of explosives on the table. Who knows what those explosives are, but theoretically, if they're sensitive enough, he could take that hammer, smack it down on top of those, right? We still have all the components. We have the explosives. We have the power source, which is the guy himself. We have the switch, which is the guy himself, and we have the initiator, which would be the hammer in this case. So it can be that simple. There's no battery involved with that one. Pretty clear distinction between the two, a complex IED versus a super simple IED, right? All right, so in summary, we'll wrap this one up. IED construction is only limited by the imagination of the person making the device. There are 4 components, and they will be present in every device in some way, shape, or form. You may have to stretch your idea of what the terms actually mean, but there will be one of these components in each of these. You have the explosives, the power supply, the detonator, and the switch. If you do not have the explosives, though, you do not have an explosive device. You do not have a bomb without explosives. That is absolutely integral. Are there any questions?
So,
That is it. Yep, go ahead. What's up?
from my understanding, you were saying that the person who initiates a victim could also cross over into the command.
Absolutely.
Could that be also that why you're saying command is because they command, they could also have a command from somebody else saying at this time you're going to detonate?
Absolutely. So in my experience, yes, they could, right? They could legitimately be a victim by our definition of the word victim. But on top of that, assuming that that person is the one that's detonating it it just wouldn't be right, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in my personal experience, you can have somebody that gets put into a situation, whatever, by threats or anything like that, and they actually have like a radio controlled device on them. Now they don't know what they're doing. Sometimes it's horrible as it is, it could be a kid, right? They have no control over it. They're not even touching the thing. Whenever the bomber wants to do it, sends the signal, and it sets off the detonator. Any other questions?